Hello, hello! I'm Lizzy Bean with Stitch People, and I'm going to walk you through the very basic set of materials you need to get started with cross-stitching. Cross-stitching is a great hobby. It's super fun, super versatile, can be really relaxing and stressful at times, but no matter what you do, how you do it, you're going to need the same basic materials to get going. So let's take a look. So the very first thing you're going to need is a pattern. Now at Stitch People, we are all about empowering you to create your own totally custom, totally personalized pattern, especially of your friends, family, and loved ones in your very own personalized portrait. Our primary book helps you mix and match your favorite men, women, children, cats, and dogs so that you can create beautifully finished family portraits out of cross stitch, but more traditional patterns are typically a one-off pattern or a small collection that has a legend or a key that shows what floss colors you'll need, and it has a really clear chart that corresponds to your fabric, which we'll go over in just a second. So whether it's a traditional pattern you're using or you're making your own pattern, you are going to want to have a pattern to reference to help you decide all the other materials that you want to get. So the second thing you're going to need to cross stitch is the fabric. Cross-stitching uses a very specific fabric called Aida. As you can see here with my sample, Aida fabric is actually woven into a really clear grid where you have holes at all the little corners where the weft and weave threads intersect, as opposed to a cotton or a linen that you might see for quilting or something like that that looks a little more solid. Aida fabric has specific holes in it that directly correspond, like I mentioned, to the grid of your pattern. So when you're doing counted cross stitch, it's really easy to translate. Every little square of color that you see in a pattern will become a stitch on your Aida fabric. Now, as a side note, Aida fabric comes in multiple sizes. The most common size is size 14, which is what I have here, but you often will see size 11 or size 18, maybe even size 28. What those numbers refer to is the number of stitches or squares that are within an inch of space. So size 14 Aida fabric, as you can see, I'll pull out my ruler here, in 1 inch of space, will have 14 stitches or squares. A size 11 fabric will only have 11 stitches or squares within 1 inch. So those stitches are actually going to be a little bigger despite the fact that the number is smaller. So it's a little confusing, but once you can connect the dots that the number corresponds to the number of stitches per inch, it'll make a lot of sense. So Aida fabric comes in a bunch of different colors. Oftentimes the color fabric you choose to use is just based on your personal preference, but it might be specified in a specific pattern you're using. So just make sure to read that pattern closely and pay attention. The next thing you're going to need for cross stitching is a hoop or a frame of some kind. You situate your fabric inside of an embroidery hoop, or I like to use a Q-snap. It's a PVC style frame that just creates less of a crease in my fabric as I use it, and it's a little easier for my hands to hold. But often you will see embroidery hoops come in many different sizes. You can buy them in bamboo, wood, plastic. Again, the frame or the hoop style that you choose to use is totally up to you, but I definitely would recommend it because it helps keep your fabric tight and more usable, and it'll make your stitching process a lot more streamlined. Next, you're going to need some tools that are really common to embroidery generally, or you might be familiar if you're a stitcher, a quilter, a sewer of some kind. You're going to need a needle, you're going to need embroidery scissors, or I sometimes like to use clippers. That's just up to personal preference. You might also see a needle minder. What this is often a metal or wood magnet of sorts that you put on your fabric like so, such that when you need to take a break from stitching, you can just leave your needle right on the magnet and it's not going to fall on the floor and be poking out of the carpet for you to step on later. So you might see people out there who really like to use needle minders because it minds your needle. You might also want to acquire a few other helpful tools. I like to have a seam ripper on hand, and I also like to have a really, really fine crochet hook. It helps me pull out mistakes if I need to undo any stitches. I find this little tiny itty bitty crochet hook to be really useful. Now, something to note about needles, there are a bunch of different types of needles out there. Beading needles, tapestry needles, crewel needles. Oftentimes tapestry needles are what are used for cross stitch because the tip is blunt, and if you recall, the Aida fabric has specific holes that make it easy to complete your cross stitches, so you don't necessarily need a pointed end. I, however, like to stitch outside the line sometimes, so I use an embroidery needle or a crewel needle that has a pointed end. You want to be careful not to poke yourself, but it does offer a little more versatility and freedom as far as using your needle as a tool is concerned. You can use it to smooth out your threads, you can use it to poke between the holes and go outside the lines a little bit if you want to make more unique stitches. I like using a size 5 embroidery needle. Last but not least, you're going to need floss. Now, embroidery floss typically comes in a skein that looks like this. You can usually identify the number on the label, whether you're using a DMC floss or any other brand. And embroidery floss is usually created of a loose twist of 6 separate threads like this. And depending on the size of Aida fabric you're using, you're rarely going to use all 6 strands of floss together at once. I prefer to use 3 threads of floss when I'm working with size 14 Aida fabric. Some people like a more sparse look and use 2, and some people like a fuller look and use 4, but I rarely use all 6. So you'll see they pull apart really easily, so when you cut a length of floss, you can split those apart and just use the number of threads that you need. Oftentimes people will take the skeins apart and just loosen that on up and twist it around a cardboard bobbin like this. You can write the number of your floss up here at the top to keep track of it. And you can keep track of your threads in a bobbin minder of some kind of binder or box. I like to use the boxes myself and keep them a little bit color-coded. So depending on how you like to store your floss, this is just one of many options, but you will need floss that corresponds to the pattern. Usually the pattern will specify what specific colors you need. If you're making your own pattern, like with a Stitch People portrait, that's where you get to really let your creativity flourish and go crazy and choose whatever colors you want for your pattern. You're gonna need floss as well. And that's really it. That covers kind of the gamut of materials that you're going to need to get started with cross stitching. You need a pattern, you need a fabric and a hoop to hold that fabric, you need some scissors to cut your floss of varying colors, and then you need your needle and maybe a couple other useful accessories that are totally optional. The crochet hook or a seam ripper or a needle minder, that's up to you. But this is really it as far as the basics are concerned. You might also want to have a pencil on hand. Just a regular pencil will do, but a water-soluble or heat-soluble pencil would also work. That way you can make some marks on the back of your fabric to help yourself stay oriented as you're working with your pattern. You might also want to consider some bigger scissors so that as you're cutting your fabric to size in preparation of working with your pattern, you've got something a little more robust that can cut through that fabric. As a note, you'll want to look on your pattern and check out what the finished dimensions of the pattern are. You may have to do a little math because it might tell you in stitches or squares the width and height of the pattern and not in inches, because the inches might change based on the size fabric you're using. But check out your pattern, figure out what the dimensions are, and then when you're cutting your fabric to size, you're going to want to add 2 inches of fabric on the top, left, right, and bottom. That's a really safe way to make sure that the edges of your fabric aren't going to fray and run into your pattern and cause any kind of problems. It's going to give you a lot of extra slack to work with. To see more of what Stitch People has to offer, visit us at stitchpeople.com and be sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest, where we have a lot going on. And if you need a pattern to get going, check out stitchpeople.com/freebies to see our collection of free patterns and find something that'll spark your creativity and really excite you. Thanks so much for watching, and happy stitching, everybody!